Well, hi. I take it you're all here because you're bored and there's nothing else to do on a Friday night in Hawaii. I'm new to your state, but immediately I received the warm welcome that I thought might be like a stereotype that just, do they really do that? And I am the proud owner of my second lay, so it's my first time to be here. 2 days, 2 lays. So I figure there's a pattern that will continue. And I have to tell you that growing up in, kind of middle class, basically suburbia, there were a lot of natural experiences I never had. And one was we had traditional Thanksgiving, but cranberries. I literally thought cranberries came in the shape of a can because my mother would just roll them out of the can and slice them up, if you've ever seen that. I didn't know cranberries were real berries. And then about lays on TV, people, they go to Hawaii and, they're waiting there and they give you the lay. And honestly, I thought for my whole life up until yesterday that lays were made of plastic. And I just assumed it as a kid because, in Texas, real flowers wilt in seconds. And I never rethought my understanding until yesterday when I received one and it smelled like a flower. And I thought that was pretty amazing. So God bless all warm, open hearts, and God bless all who need warmth and openness. And God bless us tonight. I want to talk about how we're fearfully and wonderfully made, by giving some of the basics and some of the science behind mental health, which I think goes along perfectly with our faith. I want to talk about what is mental illness and say a few things about it. I'll get right to the point here. What is mental illness? Well, it's a kind of medical illness. It's like every other kind of medical illness, and it only has one difference. Mental illness is a kind of medical illness that affects parts of the brain that we need for mental functions. Meaning, if the part of your brain that you need for a normal mood gets sick, then you can have a mood disorder like major depression or bipolar. If the part of your brain that you need for normal fear has an illness, then you can have panic disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder. Or if the part of your brain that you need for memory gets sick, you can have Alzheimer's, dementia, and so on. I'm going to use the term mental illness. Some organizations are moving to a term mental health condition, which I like a lot, but it has more syllables, and so it's harder for me to say. And also, I'm going to emphasize the medical aspects of this, and really mental illness is truly a form of illness that's like other medical illnesses in most respects. What I want to say about it is that mental illness is common, it's real, it's nobody's fault, it's not a spiritual problem, and it's treatable. So I realize that you wouldn't be here if you didn't already know this stuff. And so I realize I'm preaching to the choir. But then I think, who better to preach to than the choir? They have funny robes. They can't sneak out like normal people. And what I want to do is take things that you, I know, understand intuitively, implicitly, or explicitly, and give you some of the science behind them, which is absolutely overwhelming, and I think speaks so clearly to the reality of what we're dealing with. And I think you'll see exactly what I mean as we go forward in this talk. It astounds me every time how much and how powerful the evidence is about the realities of mental illness and its treatment. And I find it very empowering, given that we still are in a culture which isn't too sure about how to take mental illness or people who might be dealing with mental illness. So mental illness is common. Well, how common is it? Well, it sure doesn't feel common if you or someone you love is dealing with symptoms of mental illness, does it? It feels very isolating. You feel alone. You might feel ashamed. It may be hard to talk to other people or reach out to other people. It looks like everyone else is going on with their fabulously successful life, doesn't it? I mean, you get on Facebook and social media. So-and-so just had the best breakfast of their lives. And here's 14 pictures of that breakfast, which I can't always tell what it was, but it looks pretty spectacular. You know, somebody else's kid just graduated from Harvard. Somebody else got a big vacation to Hawaii. It doesn't feel common. But let's think for a minute how common it is. Out of all people in the country, over the course of an entire lifetime, how many people have had some episode of mental illness, even if it was only for a short time, for a month or two? Some people have it a long time, some people have it a short time. Well, the answer is somewhere around 46% of the population. Just a staggering number. Now, this is mild, moderate, and severe cases, meaning, as I said, some people might have a month or two of depression or alcohol abuse or alcohol addiction, and then it goes away and it never comes back. Other people, it's very common that symptoms do come back over and over and that these illnesses are chronic. But if you take the mild, moderate, and severe cases and put them all together over the course of a lifetime, a little bit under half the population. Even for the past year, this number is 26.2, so 1 out of 4 people. The more conservative number that you hear mostly is 1 out of 5 in the past year. Still an astounding number. Think about that, 20%, 1 out of 5 in 1 year. And it makes this number, as unbelievable as it is, actually very probable, very likely. And we have good evidence in these studies for all these numbers, including this one, which is if you take out the mild and moderate cases and just leave the severe ones, and severe means disabling. You can't do your job. You can't take care of your family the way you normally would. 4 to 6% of the population in any given year is disabled by mental illness. 4 to 6% of the population. That is a massive public health problem. So what these numbers tell me is, well, who does mental illness relate to? Well, mental health conditions relate to everyone. I guarantee it. I know that and I know that you can go into any room and address any group of people, and you can know that everyone in that room has been affected in some way by mental illness. Either somebody's had some experience of it themselves, or someone they love has had an experience of mental illness, a family member, a friend, a coworker. People might not know that they've been affected directly or indirectly by mental illness, but you can know for a fact that they have been. Because with 46% of the population or so affected, saying you don't know somebody who's had mental illness is kind of like saying you don't know somebody who's a woman. Yes, you do. You're just not recognizing the women around you. And same is true for mental health. This number, 26%, or even if you go with a smaller number of 20% in any given year, I looked this up. In any given year, more people experience symptoms of mental illness than have the flu. That's how common it is to the human condition. People have the flu, it's considered a normal thing. People have mental illness, it's an illness, it's not normal in one way, in another way, it's extraordinarily normal. It's part of being human for me or people who are connected to me to be affected. Now, these numbers are so huge that when they started coming out 20 years ago or so, I was skeptical. I'm a psychiatrist. I couldn't believe that the numbers would be this big. And it took me many years and more new studies coming out and looking pretty deeply into the methodology of how they do these studies and how thorough they are and how many thousands of people are involved to really convince myself that this could possibly be true. And now I know that, it may not be 46.4% exactly, but it's somewhere around there, and these numbers are substantially correct. But I also can't feel too harsh about other people who might not find these numbers unbelievable. And there are people who do find them unbelievable. So I want to talk about that part of it, because when these numbers get criticized or denied, as they do sometimes on the internet or in popular media, people are not saying it's because, these studies are no good, and so that's why we don't believe them. They're very, very well done studies. What people say as a criticism is, well, mental illness isn't real in the first place. You're measuring something that's not really real. Mental illness is a, quote, cultural construct, meaning that, psychiatrists get together, they make up books like DSM-5, And really, it's good for business to define lots of people as having mental illness, but it's just a cultural thing. It's not a real medical thing. And you will hear these arguments. They're easy to find on the internet. It's easy to find books about them. But there's nothing new about them. They go back to a classic statement that was made by a Dr. Thomas Szasz in 1961. He wrote a book called The Myth of Mental Illness. And you will still see this book quoted with approval frequently in these kinds of debates. And what Dr. Szasz says is, okay, I'm a doctor. He was a psychiatrist, actually. Dr. Szasz says, we're not doing people a favor when we tell them they have an illness, because we're basically saying, there, take a pill, don't take responsibility, you have an illness. And Dr. Szasz said what we should do is challenge people to take responsibility for their own lives. And that would be doing them a favor because, he said, I'm a doctor, and if somebody has a broken leg, I can see it on an x-ray, and if somebody has diabetes, I can measure the sugar in their blood. But if somebody has a mental illness, if I examine their brain after death, I can't really tell that it's different from anybody else's brain. So, Dr. Szasz, two things to remember about his book. One is that when he wrote this book, Dr. Szasz was correct. There was no way of showing that mental illness was also real medical illness. The other thing you should remember is that Dr. Szasz wrote his book in 1961, and 1961 was a long time ago. Here's a commercial from 1961. I cringe to read these words. So much has changed since 1961. And we've had a revolution in brain science, in neuroscience, that tells us things that Dr. Szasz could not possibly know. We have the ability to do what he could not imagine doing in 1961. We can look inside the heads of people with brain scans and see what's going on and see if activity is normal or abnormal or if different regions of the brain are affected. We have genetic studies where the risk of mental illnesses are passed down physically, genetically. You can see it even when people are adopted out into other families. Still, the risk of mental illness is passed down through genes. We have neurotransmitter studies like dopamine and serotonin and norepinephrine that become abnormal in mental illness. Nerve growth factor studies. I think of these as like plant food for nerves. Nerve growth factors go way down in the major mental illnesses, and you can actually see microscopic pictures of nerves shriveling and dying when somebody's in an episode of mental illness. Just like, thanks be to God, we can see pictures of nerves growing back as people recover from mental illness with treatment. So you also can see today what Dr. Szasz couldn't see, which is that mental illnesses affect the body and not just the brain. So in the body, hormone levels can be different. Thyroid hormone, cortisol is changed in most of the major mental illnesses. Inflammation all over the body. There's an association of increased body inflammation with the major mental illnesses, and this has major effects on health, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So we can show that mental illness is real physical illness today in a way that Dr. Szasz could not. And I'm going to show you, just for one example, some brain scan studies, but I want to say two things about those. One is that while I'm emphasizing the physical part of mental illness, I'm not saying that mental illness isn't mental. Mental illness is mental, and mental illness is physical. And we'll be talking about that, how those fit together later on in the talk. But to say mental illness is medical and physical, it's still just as much mental as we ever thought it was. It's just a lot more physical at the same time. And then the second thing about this is that we have not 10, 50, 100 studies in each of these categories. We have thousands of studies now. You read articles questioning the existence of mental illness. Just start Googling it. Just start Googling, study depressed brain and see what you come up with. There are thousands of studies in each of these categories, so it's not like it's close and you can say, well, the evidence barely shows us this about mental illness. It's pretty overwhelming. So I'm going to take one example from major depression. That's a common illness. Some people say it's not a real illness. And I'm going to look or show you pictures of people's brains with depression. And we're going to look at, well, how does the brain function seem to change in depression, and can you see abnormalities on a head scan? Can you see what Dr. Zaz could not see back in 1961? And first I have to talk about, well, what would we be looking for in the first place on a head scan? So with major depression, what we're looking for is less activity in these blue areas on the outside of each frontal lobe. So two sides of the brain here. These blue areas on each side of the frontal lobe. Why are we looking for less activity? Because in depression, people are run down. They don't have willpower, they don't have motivation, they don't have much expression on their face, they don't do much, it's hard to focus, hard to make decisions. It is literally hard to get out of bed and function when you have major depression. And one big reason is that you don't have enough activity in these areas of the frontal lobes. And so can we see abnormalities on a head scan related to this blue area? Well, you can see for yourself, because these are PET scans, and they're oldies but goodies. They illustrate the point well. Basically, a PET scan says where's the activity going on in the brain and how much activity is going on. And so you read these like weather maps. Orange and red means a lot of activity, and then yellow and green is less activity, and blue is the least. So here's a healthy brain. Here's the frontal lobe of a normal healthy brain, and look, you can see orange and red, right? Now look at the frontal lobe of people with severe chronic depression. Do you see any orange and red? No, you do not. That is abnormal functioning of people's frontal lobes in major depression that fits perfectly with the symptoms that we see. Just what we would look for in this blue area. So less activity here. Is there any way with major depression, though, that we might see more activity in a different part of the brain? So is there any way that people with major depression are actually more revved up instead of run down? People are mostly run down, but they're revved up in one way, which is emotional distress. Outside, people really, and I don't say this jokingly, people really start to look like death warmed over, and they feel like death warmed over, but inside, they're roiling with negative emotions, self-hate, self-criticism, barrage of negative thoughts about themselves and their lives. So you would expect in major depression, if something abnormal is to be seen in the brain, there'd be too much activity in these red areas, which regulate a lot of our emotional function. So guess what? Can we see this? Here you go. These are two different cuts of the same brain of a person, well, averages of people with depression. Right here, where that red area was in the picture, you can see abnormal amounts of activity. There's too much activity here because people's emotions are revved up in a negative way. So we can show you these kinds of images for all the major mental illnesses now. So there's not really a question about showing abnormalities in the brain, but we can go a step farther as well. To really show ourselves and other people that mental illness is real, let's take a common sense version. What are people afraid of when they get sick and they think it might be serious? Well, I think of three things. First, and I'm a doctor, by the way. Once I had a kidney stone, and I thought I had a dissecting aortic aneurysm that was going to kill me within minutes. And I was so relieved when I showed up at the ER and it was a kidney stone. So doctors think of all the worst things. But you get sick, you don't know what it is. Number one, I'm afraid I'm going to die, right here. Number two, I'm afraid I won't be able to function. What if I can't work? What if I can't take care of my family? And number three, I'm afraid I'll go into decline, meaning my body will gradually break down, fall apart, and in the long run, I won't be able to function or have a long, healthy life. So let's look at mental illness and say, how often does mental illness do these three things that illness does to people compared to other kinds of medical illnesses? And let's start with death. Suicide is a topic I actually don't like to talk about. And, having known people who died of suicide, It's a profoundly painful thing if you've ever been through it with anybody close to you or ever been to the point of contemplating suicide. But I really think this information is so important that it's worth talking about and it's worth looking at. So what we can say about suicide is that this is a cause of death, and 90% of the time, people commit suicide due to the presence of a mental illness. So what we can do then is take people who die by suicide and say mental illness is killing people with suicide, and then we can compare it to people dying of other medical illnesses and say, well, how bad and how real really is mental illness? So in the young adult age category, as you could see here, but you already probably would have guessed this, ages 15 to 24, suicide is the second leading medical cause of death, second only to accidents. But what about, say, people in the 18 to 65 age range? What about people who are in the prime earning years of their lives? Where do suicide and mental illness rank? How often do they kill people? Well, suicide and mental illness are the number 4 cause of death amongst all medical causes of death in the 18 to 65 age range. Suicide and mental illness kill more people at these ages than diabetes, than liver disease, than lung disease, than strokes, than HIV. And get this, suicide, and by the way, this number has gone way up since 2007, so suicide kills more than twice as many people as murder. You ever wake up in the middle of the night scared somebody's breaking in to kill you? Well, mathematically, we should be twice as scared of ourselves as we should of anyone else, because we're much more a threat of ourselves to ourselves, and that is due pretty much entirely to mental illness. So it's deadly. Is it disabling? Well, you know where this talk's going now. Here you go. Mental and behavioral disorders, the dark orange line here. Mental health conditions, mental illness, the number 1 cause of years lost to disability in this country. More than back pain, arthritis, heart disease, lung disease, more than everything else, mental illness makes people lose time to disability. That's as a category. If you break it down to single illnesses, you find that major depression is now the number 1 cause of medical disability in the world. Number 1. So it's deadly, it's extraordinarily disabling, even when you compare it to other medical conditions. What about decline? Does it have an effect, a negative effect on people's health over time? Well, some very smart researchers started looking into this, something I would never thought of, but what they found was in the most severe cases, people with serious mental illness like severe schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, that go and get treatment in mental health centers, and those are the most severe cases, their average lifespan is 25 years shorter. 25 years, 1/3 shorter. It's an astounding number. Even if you average it out with all the mental illnesses and you take all the cases, mild, moderate, and severe, with over 200 studies so far, on average, mental illness takes 10 years off the lifespan. 10 years. People are twice as likely to die in any given period of time if they have a mental illness. How does this work? Well, we don't know all the reasons, but I mentioned inflammation before, hormone changes, stress, mental illnesses are very hard on the body, and one thing that extra inflammation does is it increases the risk of heart disease. So if you have heart disease and you get depressed, then your risk of dying of a heart attack is just doubled. Inflammation relates to developing diabetes. If you will stick with depression here, if you have depression, your risk of diabetes goes up by 38%. So you can see mental illness, and I can give you examples for all the others, bipolar, schizophrenia, anxiety disorders, for instance. We might not think of those as bad. Well, anxiety doubles somebody's risk of having a stroke. It's really extraordinary how hard these illnesses are on the body. Now, if you have dealt with things like this or have them in your life, or if you're feeling depressed or anxious today, I am not saying that you are doomed. I am not saying you're going to keel over and there's nothing you can do. Mental illnesses are serious, but they're also treatable, as we're going to talk about. So if we ignore them and just think, oh, I'm having a bad attitude, or, what's wrong with me? I should quit feeling sorry for myself. I won't go to the doctor. Yes, if we ignore them, they're dangerous. But they're also very treatable, and no one is doomed, as we shall see. All right. The influence of, say, depression, again, I'm just using this as an example, is so great that I've heard researchers at meetings say that being depressed is probably as bad for your health as smoking cigarettes. That's how big a deal this is. Is mental illness all in your head? I think you know what I think now, and I think you see why I say the scientific evidence is absolutely overwhelming. These are real medical problems. Nobody chooses, nobody decides, oh, I'll get up and feel depressed today. Sometimes I think we forget, and sometimes I think we lose track and lose perspective because we wish it weren't so bad, and we wish it weren't so real, and we wish we could just get up and get on with it and, quote, stop feeling sorry for ourselves. But in fact, mental illnesses are common, real, disabling, deadly, hard on the body, takes years off your life. Hey, you're all inspired now, aren't you? You're ready to go? Let's go back to churches and deal with mental illness. No, it's pretty heavy. It's pretty intense, and it's a relief to know that it's real if you're dealing with it. But it also can be overwhelming at times. So now I want to talk about some things that can help us hold on to hope, and some things that can make us smile when we look at ourselves in the mirror of mental illness. So what's the good part? Well, there's a lot of good news. I could talk about it for the rest of this conference, but 3 things I'll stress. Mental illness is no one's fault. It's not a spiritual problem. And finally, it's treatable. Now, why am I going to go on mental illness is nobody's fault? Well, human nature is why. Whenever something bad happens, you can see it on TV with politics, right? But probably at work it's the same way. Sometimes, sadly, in churches and families, something bad happens, and what's the first item of discussion? Not, how are we going to fix this? That's down the list. The first item of discussion is, whose fault is it? Exactly. And the answer is, it's someone else's fault. So the blame game is sadly common for all human beings. It's the way they are. And in psychiatry and mental health, we have not been immune from this. And I am sad to say in my profession, we have played the blame game in past decades. Very sorry. The worst example was this very ugly word, the schizophrenogenic mother. That was a fancy word for blaming mom, Blame mom for everything, blame parents. Parents were told, in a devastating position, your child has this chronic, disabling, scary mental illness, and then parents were told, well, it's your fault. It's your fault. Devastating, traumatizing, and downright wrong. If you've ever been in the position as a parent where someone has told you it's your fault, I would like to say, if a mental health professional had anything to do with that, I apologize. I'm sorry. My field went wrong in this way, out of good intentions, and the time at which we can rationalize blaming parents or other family members is long over. So we can happily get rid of that. Now, psychiatrists aren't all bad. Sometimes we've been blamed for, making this stuff up or being, quote, pill pushers. I think I've already said a little bit about that. The biggest group to blame, though, when in doubt, who do we blame? We blame the victim, right? So we blame people with mental illness. People have been told in past years, not just by laypersons who have an excuse, but by mental health professionals, hey, you want to be depressed. You want to be anxious. You just don't want to get up and do something, or you don't want to get up and get a job. Again, very toxic, very traumatizing, and very wrong. I've been a psychiatrist for 25 years. I have not met one single person who wanted to be depressed or anxious or have schizophrenia or anything else. In fact, people who've had mental illnesses with mental pain and have had terrible physical pain and injury too, you know what they'll tell you? To the last person, they will say the mental pain is worse. and they would rather have physical illness and physical pain over mental illness and mental pain any day. So we can stop blaming the victims. This is another way that people have been blamed in the past. If you just had faith, just read your Bible, just pray. Why are you depending on pills? Why are you going to a secular doctor? Well, I tried to think of every way of putting this just to say no, it's not a spiritual problem. If somebody's depressed or has an addiction or has the ups and downs of bipolar, manic depression, are they less spiritual? Do they have less faith? Are they more of a sinner? I don't think so. In fact, when I review evidence like I'm presenting tonight, I start thinking, how on earth did we ever think this in the first place? Right? I mean, we've pretty much gotten over thinking, well, so-and-so got cancer because they're a sinner. Well, no, they probably got sick because they're human, and we all get sick sooner or later. This is our lot as fallen creatures. But nevertheless, with mental illness, this kind of thing persists. So I've thought a lot about, well, why does this way of thinking persist? And the reason that I blame is called dualism. And I know that not a single person in this world woke up this morning and went in for breakfast and said to somebody in their family, you know, I've been thinking a lot about dualism and this is really bugging me. And I've realized blah, blah, blah about dualism. No one thinks I'm a dualist, but that has been our unspoken way of thinking for 500 years. And I think we're moving out of this, but basically, dualism is this understanding that we don't need a word for, we may just do it, this understanding that everything is either physical or non-physical. And if it's non-physical, then it's mental or spiritual. And if it's physical, well, then it's physical stuff. And so human beings are divided into the body on one side and the spirit or soul on the other. And that means that if somebody's body is sick, you have a medical illness, well, that's physical. That's okay to go get a physical treatment from the doctor and take medicine. So we haven't had much of a problem with that part. But if it's mental, well, wait a minute. That's on the mental, non-physical side. That's not physical. That's your thoughts. That's your faith. That's things you can control. You can't go get a medicine for that. You don't see a doctor for that. And so I think we've had this unsettled ambivalence about, is it really okay to seek medical treatment for mental health conditions? And I think it's based on this thing, dualism. So this is why I bring up dualism a lot, until people get tired of it, and then maybe they won't forget. And one interesting thing about dualism is it's really from the ancient Greek philosophers. It's not from the Bible. What we see in the Bible is that human beings are wholes, and our bodies belong with all the rest of us and aren't really separable from our souls and spirits. But if we want a model, if we want to divide up aspects of who we are, this is the one that I feel works the best with Scripture and also works very well with what I do as a psychiatrist, which is body, soul, and spirit. And in this model, we have a physical body. Yes, that's entirely physical. And then we have a spirit that's entirely non-physical, right? God is spirit. God is non-physical. But in between, human beings are special because we have something called soul, or the modern word for it in psychology is mind. And that's our thoughts, feelings, emotions, and willpower. And you know what? Is this mind or soul physical, or is it non-physical? Well, it's both. It's physical and it's non-physical. And I like this because this not only fits very well with Scripture, and I could cite chapter and verse if we needed to do that, it also fits well with neuroscience and psychology. Now, in physical science, we don't talk about spiritual things. Those are non-physical, so that's not in the domain of science. So we're not looking for things about the spirit in science, but the rest of the model, a physical body and then a physical and non-physical mind, that's exactly the way they talk about it in neuroscience. And they say that mind and brain are like two sides of the same coin. So if I have a thought or if I get depressed, is it mental or is it physical? It's both. And it doesn't mean, if it's more mental, then it's less physical. Or if it's more physical, it's less mental. It's two sides of the coin. There's not more heads and less tails, right? There's heads and tails that go together on the whole coin all the time. And if we see it this way, then it helps explain very well, can you get a physical treatment for a mental illness? Yeah, of course you can. It's physical. Can you get a mental treatment for a mental illness? Can you do talk therapy? Of course you can. Does it work? Yes, it does, as we will see. All right, so why do I have a picture of an angel? Well, this reminds me of these truths, because angels, I take it, are non-physical, or at least they don't have bodies in the way we do. So can an angel get a heart attack? I don't think so. Do angels get diabetes? No, I doubt it. Bladder infections? No. What about schizophrenia? Do angels get schizophrenia? Do angels get major depression? No, I don't think so. Why not? They don't have physical brains the way we do. They don't have physical bodies. Spiritually, can an angel sin? Oh, yes. Angels can sin. As bad as human beings, if not worse. They're spiritual beings. Sin is a spiritual condition. Mental illnesses are not sin, and they're not a spiritual condition per se. Does our spirituality affect mental illness? Yes, it does. But we can't confuse the nature of what's spiritual and what has to do with the mind and mental illness. All right, mental illness is treatable. This is the best news of all. I'm going to show you just how good it is. Treatable does not mean that we can cure it in most cases. Many people get discouraged about this. Many people who are doctors in other fields say to me, I don't know how you could be a psychiatrist. How could you do this? I'd be depressed all the time. People coming in, telling their sad stories, they don't get better. And these other doctors, they know mental illness is real, by the way. I would say 99% of medical doctors in any field take mental illness as real medical illness, but they don't realize how treatable it is. And so other doctors, when they're in this mode of, I could never be a psychiatrist, they're thinking like they're TV doctors, right? You know how TV doctors are? The person comes in the room in a gurney. The doctor doesn't even examine them, doesn't even talk to them. Just says, they're having a tension pneumothorax. We need 8 units of whole blood, blah, 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 stat. The doctor magically knows what's going on. And then within hours to days, the person is cured, right? Now, that is true in a few cases, and those cases are always of acute illness. What's an acute illness? Well, that's an illness that is short-term. Right? If you have the flu, you may have it for a week or two. You're not going to have the flu 6 months later. It's an acute illness. If you have a broken leg and you break it, it's going to heal badly or well, depending on your treatment. But if you have a broken leg today, 6 months later, that leg will not be broken. There's a morbid saying amongst surgeons. It says, all bleeding stops eventually. And when you think about it, it really does. Bleeding is an acute condition. Doesn't go on forever. Doctors love to treat these. An ear infection, something I can give you antibiotics for. Doctors love this. The interesting thing, though, is that most doctors spend most of their time treating chronic illnesses which we cannot cure. They just kind of rumble on and on. These are like high blood pressure, high cholesterol, heart disease, diabetes, arthritis. The major medical problems that we have in contemporary Western societies are all chronic illnesses. And guess what? We can't cure any of them. We have good treatments for them, but we can't cure diabetes. We can't cure heart disease. We can't cure high blood pressure. We can't cure high cholesterol. But we have good treatments for all of them. So somebody, somewhere, by the name of Leucht, led a group of researchers who said, well, let's look at this. Let's look at how treatable are mental health conditions compared to other medical conditions. Because look, most medical conditions we don't cure. Most mental health conditions we don't cure, but we have treatments for them. So they came up with this weird graph that looks to me like the Charlie Brown Christmas tree. And like the Charlie Brown Christmas tree, you will think it's pathetic and lopsided in the beginning, but in the end you will love this graph. How it works is this. They said, well, let's compare apples to apples. Let's compare if you get a medicine from your primary care doctor for an illness like high blood pressure or ulcers or asthma, and we'll use a white dot here, and we'll say, well, how effective is that treatment? And then these blue dots are if you go to the psychiatrist and you get a medicine for bipolar, schizophrenia, or depression, how effective are these treatments? All right, and so the only axis here is up and down, and this is efficacy. Efficacy is a medical measurement that gives you a number from around 0 all the way up to around 1, and it can be higher or lower than 0 to 1. But basically, it's a 0 to 1 scale. And 8.8.91 is a highly effective medical treatment. You can see up here at this level, there's not many, but this one is just a home run. I don't know what this miracle cure is, but I want it. And then down here, 0.2, 0.10, these treatments, 0 and below, they're probably not effective at all. You probably get side effects and no effects from these treatments. And then the middle, where you see most of the treatments are around 0.4 to 0.5, good, strong, solid medical treatments, but they're not cures and they're not home runs. All right, so these researchers said all these general medical conditions, high blood pressure, ulcers, asthma, we'll just take them and we'll plot them on how effective the treatment is. And then all the mental health conditions, here in blue, these are like major depression and attention deficit and anxiety disorders. We'll plot them for how effective they are. And it turns out that the white dots, the general medical conditions, if you average them all out, 0.4 to 0.5 is a mathematical average. If you go to your primary care doctor and you get a pill, the average treatment, the average prescription that you get has a moderate, good, solid level of efficacy. Whereas with mental health conditions, if you go to the psychiatrist and you get a medicine, guess what? The number is between 0.4 and 0.5. You have the same chance of responding to a medicine from the psychiatrist as you do to respond to a medicine from your primary care doctor. And most people, even most doctors, do not realize it, but now you do, and you know why I love this graph. So mental illness is treatable, and the great thing is this study is just for medicines. This is comparing medicines to medicines. In mental health, I've said over and over that they're both mental and physical, so guess what? We have mental treatments too. We have talk therapy, which for most cases of mental illness is just as effective as medicines. And it's not an argument of, oh, is one good and the other bad? They work together better than they work alone, and they work together very well. There are all sorts of other treatments. Exercise is really good for the brain, releases nerve growth factors. By the way, good news for lazy people like me, it looks like for your brain health, you don't have to exercise very hard. And it looks like that you don't have to exercise that often. And is science great or what? Prayer and meditation, group treatments, programs like Alcoholics Anonymous, other 12-step programs. Now, I've gone on and on and on. Mental illness is not a spiritual problem. Why is prayer up here? And actually, I could have put, along with social support, attending religious services. Well, those are actually good for your brain health. Prayer, attending religious services, attending church is good for your health. Okay, this does not mean that if someone lived a life that wasn't sinful, they wouldn't have pains and illnesses. This means that we are made to be in relationship with our Creator, in relationship with each other, and when we are, our bodies and brains function better. So we have things to do for our mental health that are physical, that are mental, and that are also spiritual. So we have a huge array of treatments, including talk therapy and exercise, 12-step, prayer and meditation, that are proven to help people with mental illness. And scientifically proven, not just somebody thought they were a good idea, not just somebody you like endorsed them, good, solid scientific studies. So, I hope you feel as I do now that the evidence is just overwhelming and actually pretty heartwarming and helps us take mental health problems that we have and that other people have in a more loving, a more compassionate, and a more hopeful way. Mental illness is real, it's common, it's nobody's fault, and it's treatable. Please know, if you are dealing with mental illness or somebody you love is, you're not alone, you're not making this up, you're not to blame, and you are not doomed. So God bless us this weekend, and God bless you all for being here. Thank you for your endurance and listening to this talk.